Hi, it's Steve Dodson here. Quick video. We've had a few questions from people asking about the importance of the land with reference to Genesis chapter 1 and chapter 2. And we've also had some questions around the possible explanation as to why there is no "and God saw that it was good" for day 2. So we're going to do just a very short video, about 5 minutes, and answer that last question last at the end, because I think it will make more sense. And first we'll talk just a little bit about the land and the importance of the land. Now, we suggested in our first class that the very purpose of Genesis 1 and 2 is to connect the ideas with the very theme of the book of Moses, to provide the background. And I think there's two primary points that are being made, and that is there's a direct link between the great God, the creator of heaven and earth, and the God of the fathers, the God of Israel, Yahweh, and the purpose of Yahweh with his people, despite the failure of mankind, that his purpose is as it was at the creation and remains his purpose, to fill the earth with people like you and I that reflect his glory. And that's the blessing that God gave. And two primary sort of ideas are the land, which he prepares and fills it with people that receive the blessing of God. And so this, I believe, is the focus of the Genesis record, and remains the purpose of the books of Moses. And so the land becomes really important. So we've made the observation that the 6 days of creation are God preparing a land for his people, preparing the habitation in the first 3 days, and then filling it with the inhabitants in the second 3 days. And so from the creation right through Genesis, right through to the promises made to Abraham, reiterated to Isaac and Jacob, and then seen in the Exodus, are all about this promise that God has that he will establish a people reflecting his glory in this land. Now, with regard to the land, it has been traditional for people to think that the land of Eden is in fact in the cradle of civilization in the area of Mesopotamia. And I'd like to suggest to you that I don't think that this was the case. Now, there's two reasons why I think people say that that's where Eden was. The first one is because traditionally archaeologists and historians have always said that the most ancient of civilizations are in this area of Mesopotamia, that is up near the river Euphrates and Tigris. And the second reason, probably equally as important, is the river Euphrates is mentioned as an area for Eden in Genesis chapter 2. Genesis chapter 2, verse 14, in fact. And we'll have a look at that in just a second. But the particular details of the Garden of Eden, which are given in Genesis 2, I think are more broadly and more interesting than that. We find that the Garden of Eden, it appears, is a garden in the area called Eden. There's both the land of Eden and then there's the Garden of Eden. And so, whilst I can't be dogmatic about it, it reads to me at least like there's a larger area of Eden, and then in this area is a garden, which becomes known as the Garden of Eden. So where was this area of Eden? Well, let's have a look at Genesis chapter 2, verse 10. In Genesis chapter 2, verse 10, we're given some details about the land. It says that there was a river that went out of Eden to water the garden, and from thence it was parted and became 4 heads. The name of the first was Pison, which is compassed by the whole land of Havilah, where there's gold, and the gold of that land is good. There is bdellium and the onyx stone. And the name of the second river is Gihon. The same is it which compassed the whole land of Ethiopia. The name of the third river is Hiddekel, that which goes down towards Assyria. And the fourth is Euphrates. So we've got 4 rivers mentioned. Now, there's no way you can look on a map and find these 4 rivers and identify where Eden is. But we can identify a few things. We know where at least Euphrates is today. You can see it there on the map. So we know where that is. We're told that the river Hiddekel is a river that ran down to Ethiopia. And so we wonder whether that might indeed reflect what the Nile is today. So we've got the river Euphrates. We've got an area which could well be the Nile Delta today. Then we're told there's a place or a river called Gihon. The only Gihon we know about, of course, is the Gihon Spring, on top of which Jerusalem is built. So that is certainly not a river, but it's the only Gihon we know. And Pison, well, we have no idea where that is. Now, of course, between this time and later in Genesis, we have the flood. And it's quite likely, it seems, that the flood completely changed the earth so that these rivers were not in the same place that they were right at the beginning in Genesis. We also note that in Genesis chapter 13, in the story of Lot, it says that the plain that Lot looked down on, the plain of Jordan, which Lot admired, it says it was watered everywhere, like the garden of the Lord and like Egypt. And so the garden of the Lord, almost certainly a reference to the area of Eden, which extends down to Egypt, which was almost like Egypt as well. This, of course, raises many questions. But the record in Genesis 13 goes on to say, this was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So the record that's written after the time of Lot is saying, well, that's what it was like before the Lord destroyed this Sodom and Gomorrah. We know what it's like today, but it was different back then. And so what we end up with is perhaps, and we can't be dogmatic about it, but we end up with an area that probably goes between the river Euphrates and the river Nile and looks something like this. And so are we at all surprised when 2,000 years later, when God promises the promised land, the good land to Abraham, he actually identifies the land that he's going to give to Abraham. We know this well. Genesis 15 verse 18, and it says, in the same day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, unto thy seed I have given this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river of Euphrates. And so Abraham is promised this land, which we suggest may well be the very land of Eden, the area called Eden, as it was in the very beginning. And so the events of Genesis chapter 1 through to Genesis chapter 3 foretell or forecast the events which are going to occur thereafter. So God prepares the land in Genesis 1. He prepares it for his people, which are Adam and Eve. He gives it to them on the condition that they obey him. Of course, in Genesis 3, we find that they disobey God and they're expelled from the garden and they're sent east from the garden, east into another land. And later, God promises the land to the descendants of Abraham on the condition that they obey him and believe him. And when they eventually do disobey God, they're expelled from the land to the east, of course, to the area of Babylon. And so we see this sort of the same process, the creation process, repeated again in the story of Israel, the whole history of Israel. And then there's littler stories within that. There's the story of Abraham, who goes out of the land and comes back into the land. Isaac does the same thing. Jacob does the same thing. And so we have little stories within big stories. And we know that this fulfillment of God's desire to fill this land with people that reflect his glory, of course, will be ultimately realized when Israel is brought back into the land, our Lord Jesus Christ is set up as the King, and we, God willing, will be amongst those who set up the kingdom of God in the age to come. It's really interesting when we look at the land, we find that the perspectives are the same. The idea of judgment has the same idea. And so when Adam and Eve were sent out of the garden, we know they were sent towards the east. And likewise, when the people of Israel were sent out of the land of Egypt, Israel, they were sent towards the east. Genesis 3 verse 24. God drove the man, and he placed at the east of the Garden of Eden cherubims and a flaming sword which turned away to keep the way of the tree of life. And we know the same thing happened to the people of Israel when they were in the land. Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, carried away the captives. The poor of the people and the residue of the people remained in the city. And of course, he took them to the east, to the area of Babylon, the city of Babylon. And so that area of the east becomes representative of people that have rejected and left the special place, the special good land which God has prepared for them. And so that is a theme that continues throughout the rest of scriptures. And so it seems likely that, as we say, the land of Eden was the land of Israel as it was, perhaps in its greater extent. And so when the tabernacle is set up, and then subsequently the temples are set up, they all specifically face the west, so that when you return from the east area and head west into the promised land, you come into the place where God dwells. And so the temple and the tabernacle always faced the east direction for that reason. And so we have set up the idea of heading east is leaving God, and coming west is coming back to the place where God is. The other interesting thing we find, which seems to be consistent and is repeated through the scriptures, is that this land is protected by an angelic presence. When Adam is exiled to the east, we're told that the cherubims are set up there to protect the entrance into the garden. We find that when Jacob comes back into the land, we're told in Genesis 32 verse 1, that when Jacob went on his ways, angels of God met him. And when Jacob saw them, he said, "This is God's army." And he called the name of the place Mahanaim. And later in that chapter, of course, he wrestles with one of God's angels. And when Joshua brings the people of God back into the land, we know the first thing that happens as he's just about to cross Jordan, we find that, well, it says in Joshua 5 verse 13, it came to pass when Joshua was by Jericho, he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, there stood a man over against him with his sword drawn in his hand. And Joshua went unto him and said unto him, "Art thou for us or for our adversaries?" And he said, "Nay, but as the captain of the host of Yahweh, I am come." And Joshua fell on his face and worshipped and said, "What saith my Lord unto his servant?" And the captain of the Lord's army said unto Joshua, "Loose thy shoe from off thy foot, for the place whereon thou standest is holy." And Joshua did so. So the author is making these parallels, painting the picture of Eden and comparing that with the picture of the promised land as it was. And so as readers, we're being asked to see that this is the way that God works. And of course, it has implications for us. We did actually look at this verse, but it's a verse that is really interesting because it plucks all of the ideas, or many of the ideas, out of the story of creation and shows that the exile of the people of Israel, the taking of Judah by Nebuchadnezzar, the exile, is creation, if you like, in reverse. The same expression, tohu abohu, is used here in this quote in Jeremiah 4, verse 23 to 26, where Jeremiah says, "I beheld the land, and lo, it was without form and void. The heavens, they had no light. I beheld the mountains, and lo, they trembled, and all the hills moved lightly. I beheld, and lo, there was no man. All of the birds of heaven were fled, and beheld, and lo, the fruitful place was a wilderness, and all the cities were broken down." And so this language reflects the fact that, if you like, the creation had been undone. The purpose of God establishing the land, being a place for his people, was lost, and the people were being expelled eastward into Babylon as a result. And then God again uses a lot of the language of Genesis when he makes this proclamation in Jeremiah 27 with regard to Nebuchadnezzar. where God says, I have made the earth. I made the earth. I made the land, he says. And it's on this basis. He says, I made the land, the man, and the beast that are upon the earth, or upon the land. By my great power and my outstretched arm, and I've given it unto whom seemeth meet to me. So in other words, God's reminding the Israelites, reminding you and I, that it's God's creation, it's his land, and he will give it to whomsoever he chooses. He goes on and says, and now have I given all these lands unto the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, my servant, and the beasts of the field I have given him also to serve him. And we have expressions out of both Genesis 1 and 2 here. And what God is saying here is that it's my land. I prepared the land, and I'll give it to whomever I choose. The people of Israel thought it was their right. But in fact, it wasn't their right to be in the land. They were there by invitation to God. God was inviting them to join him to receive his blessing and share that as a benefit with him. But they rejected him. And as a result, God took them out of the land. And God says, it's my land. I created it. I'll give it to whoever I will. And what is the land that God gave to Nebuchadnezzar? We don't have it on the screen, but in verse 3, he says, it's the land of Edom, Moab, Ammon, Tyre, and Zidon. That whole area that we suggest was the land potentially of Eden, and certainly the land that was promised to Abraham and his descendants. Well, with that as a background, it doesn't seem related, but I'm going to suggest it is. I'd like to have a go at answering the question, why is there no "and God saw that it was good" in day 2? It's there in all of the other days. But day 2 is unique in the sense that at no stage does God say what he did in day 2 is good. Now, we're not told why it's not a good thing, so we can't be definite, but I have a suggestion. The first thing is we need to think about, well, what does good actually mean? It seems entirely obvious that everything that God does is good. There's nothing that God does that is bad. And so there must be a context to the word good. It must have some additional meaning to simply being good, in the sense that everything God does is good. So there's a context of being good, and that is, well, how does it relate to the very purpose of God? How is it relating to what God is actually doing? Well, what is God doing? Well, we've suggested that what God's doing is he's preparing a land for a blessing. And so the days are all related to the preparation of the land. So day 1, of course, is light for the land. Day 3 is dry land and vegetation. Day 4 is the seasons for the land, so the seasons for the crops, and the tides for the seas, etc. Day 5 are the fish and the birds. Day 6 are the animals and man. Well, what about day 2? Well, day 2 seems to have nothing to do with the land. Day 2, of course, is the separation of the waters. The waters remain over the earth, over the land, and then there's a separation between the waters below and the waters above. But they actually have no effect on the land as such. And so the things that were done on day 2, although necessary, both physically and necessary, as we have seen as part of the parable of creation, nonetheless had really no effect on the land per se. And so is it possible that because day 2 didn't have a particular influence on the land itself, it is therefore not necessarily then said to be a good thing for man? That's an idea. Have a think about it. If you have any other ideas, I'd love to hear about it. Thanks for sharing.